It's time to face a certain fact. Everything you think you know about immigration is probably wrong. Now, immigration is in the news quite a bit these days, and not for the good reasons. You're watching crackdowns happen in real time. People who've been here 20, 30, 40 years sometimes getting detained and, in certain cases, deported. Deportations up to an extraordinary degree. The budget for ICE has ballooned with the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. Enforcement at a bare minimum, you can say quite euphemistically, is way, way up. You're getting one of two responses as a consequence. On the one hand, the American right, they have some reservations about how this is going down, but President Donald Trump did, in fact, campaign on mass deportations, and that's, to a degree anyway, what you're getting. On the other side, you have the left, and they are quite concerned with the inhumanity that you're watching, and of course, things like due process violations. But in either case, what you're not hearing is this is really bad for us. There's this tendency in America to view immigrants as either villains or victims, people to be controlled in one sense because they cannot be trusted to be a part of us, or another kind of group that you certainly don't have any animosity towards, but become some kind of a nuisance or, at a bare minimum, a cost we have to bear. It turns out none of that is correct. And in fact, what the reality is, what the result ends up being, it turns out neither of those framings are accurate. And in fact, something else ends up being true in the end. Immigrants are good for all of us. They are contributors to the economy. They are contributors to the tax base. They do not bring down wages. They are not a problem for the public coffers. And to the extent we get rid of them, we are engaging in self-harm. To further this conversation, today we're speaking with Professor Zeke Hernandez, who teaches at the Wharton School of Business at the University of Pennsylvania. He is the author of a book that I recently finished, The Truth About Immigration. This book was a tour de force and debunked so many things that I thought were true about immigrants. And I say that as somebody who was pro-immigrant to begin with, as the son and the husband of one, but it still managed to correct some of the misgivings that I had in the course of this. But this book is important not merely because it offers solutions and an understanding about how to understand immigration, but rather what it does is it tells us what the future could look like. We are living at a time of great uncertainty. We are living at a time of instability, social, financial, and other forms of instability. And there appears to be a bipartisan consensus right now that one of the ways in which we could ameliorate these problems is by boarding up the windows, putting tariffs on our goods, not letting people in, and closing ourselves off from the immigrant experience. And it turns out that the more that we do that, the more we are securing our own doom. We are tearing at our own social fabric. We are ripping apart our own communities. We are destroying our own tax base. We are decimating consumer spending. And the list goes on. It is not merely a financial consideration or even a macroeconomic consideration. It is one of culture. It is one of national security. And it is one, frankly, of a prosperous American future. And to the extent you want one, you have to have immigrants in order to get there. Today, my conversation with Professor Zeke Hernandez covers all of this and then some. Without further ado, here's Professor Hernandez. Professor Zeke Hernandez, thank you for your time.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
So I have so many questions about this. I guess the best place for me to start would be, what can you tell us, maybe in the last 20 or so years, how would you describe how definitive the scholarship is on immigration that allows you to make the kinds of conclusions you're making? How certain can we be about the data that I would argue is, and what you present as, largely exonerating and in fact quite supportive of the notion that immigrants are important contributors to society?
That's an excellent question. Everybody should start with that question. Look, the last 20 years have been, in some ways, a great time to study immigration. There's been a boom of very, very good research. A lot of it's driven by the fact that we just have better data than we have ever had. mainly from the United States, but also from many, many other countries. Why? Because we've been able to access census micro data. So that's not summary data. That is literally data on every individual in a population that allows us to come to very solid conclusions about immigration. We also just have better empirical methods that allow us to not just come up with correlational relationships, but assess cause and effect. Okay. So we just have better data, better methods, and there's just been kind of a boom of interest in immigration. The other thing that's happened is that we've moved beyond very narrow questions like how do immigrants affect natives in the labor market? And we've been able to answer a much wider array of questions that give us a much fuller picture of how immigrants affect our economy and our society, which I'm sure we're going to get into in the conversation. So now this is, at the end of the day, this is still science and this is still social science, right? So what I'm presenting in the book, what I'm trying to present based on my own and others' research is the best evidence up to now, right? Does that mean that things can't change? No, it doesn't mean that. Things always change in science. But the other thing I've done is I've tried to not come to conclusions based on one or two studies, but based on a preponderance of evidence from many, many studies, right? So that's, I think we know a lot, but we always have to be humble, of course.
This leads me to the second question, which is, if the data is so good, why does the debate over immigration feel so hopeless and removed from reality?
Well, some of it is that, again, 20 years in science is actually not that long, right? It takes a long time for the preponderance of evidence to sort of make it to the mainstream, right? Because it's not like the average person, your neighborhood is reading the evidence. And so a lot of what's out there in the media and the headlines, a lot of the things politicians say, if they're based on any evidence at all, is probably outdated. But also a lot of it is that this is a debate that goes beyond data. It's deeply emotional, right? And the other thing that's happened is that we don't live in an information neutral environment when it comes to immigration. There is a powerful, organized, well-funded, orchestrated movement that for political reasons is telling you that immigrants are here to harm you, right? It's what I call the villain message, because if I can convince you that this outsider, this newcomer is the cause of your problems, right? Is causing you to lose your job, is the cause of crime and other concerns that you have. That's easy. It's effective. It's catchy. It's a simple answer to a lot of what concerns people. So there are political incentives to tell exactly the opposite of what's true. And unfortunately, the pro-immigrant side has not had a good comeback. The pro-immigrant side, instead of saying, look, immigrants are good for us for reasons A, B, C, says, well, immigrants are these needy victims. This is what I call the victim message. These needy outsiders, right? We got to be compassionate toward them. We got to be nice out of the goodness of our hearts. But that's a pretty weak comeback to the villain message, right? Because one message is appealing to your fear and self-interest. The other one is appealing to your compassion. In politics, compassion isn't very effective.
Right. And even as a compassionate view, that sort of implicitly suggests that the immigrants are a drain. They are a thing to be cared for because they cannot do it themselves, right? I mean, to your point, there's a humanity in it, but also, what are we going to do about this? This is not helpful to us. Whereas your book seems to suggest quite the opposite, that in fact, this narrative and this framing, either victim or the villain, neither of these are essentially a correct paradigm.
Yeah, that's really well put, right? The problem is that villain and victim are perfectly consistent with each other, right? That is, immigrants could be damaging us. It could be very costly to welcome them into our communities. It might be the morally right thing to do, but then you have this contest between, do we take care of our own needs first, or do we take care of outsiders first? And of course, it's very easy to make the case for, hey, let's first take care of our own house, so to speak. And so what the third option is, which is based on the data, is that immigrants are net positive contributors to everything that's good for us. And that's win-win. So what the implication is not just that immigration is good for immigrants, but that we need immigrants because of what's good for us, right? And that's very different, right? Because the moment I'm saying, look, you need this because it's going to make your life more prosperous, it's going to make your kids' life better, that's really different than just saying, hey, just be nice to these needy people, right?
So your book centers on, with an enormous amount of data and an enormous amount of evidence put forward, that there is more than just an economic case, but focusing for the time being on the economic case for what immigrants deliver. It centers around basically 5 things: investment, innovation, tax dollars, essentially net contributors on jobs, and then the influx of skills and talent. It's a big question. Can you unpack these 5 pillars and why the data seems to suggest this so clearly?
Yeah, give me a moment to do that. I think that a very simple way to do it is I use the 5 fingers of my hand, right? Immigrants bring 5 key economic inputs: investment, innovation, talent, consumption, and taxes, right? Anyone who wants jobs and economic growth, any economy, community needs these 5 things. And so what the evidence says is that basically immigrants, because they bring these 5 things, are net job creators and net contributors to the economy. And that might seem like really esoteric and high level, but let me bring it down to the level of like your neighborhood, right? So let's start with investment. Nothing is going to happen economically in your community if someone isn't investing in a business that creates jobs, that pays taxes, et cetera, et cetera. Well, we know that immigrants bring investment in 2 ways. One, they're 80% more likely than non-immigrants to start a business. And that's everything from Google and Zoom to the local, ethnic restaurant that introduces the food you love. The other mechanism of investment is that immigrants are like magnets of capital from their home countries. A story I tell in the book is of a restaurant chain called Pollo Campero. It's one of the fastest growing restaurant chains in America. It's from Guatemala. And it has followed an expansion path into America of establishing restaurants where like Central American and Latino immigrants live. But in the process, right, it has created thousands of jobs that it has invested, hundreds of millions of dollars into American communities. And so, just those 2 mechanisms increase investment. Then we get into innovation. Right. One of the statistics that I mentioned in the book that to me is still staggering every time I think about it: immigrants are responsible for 36% of all patents in the United States. Right. That's crazy, Luke, isn't it? 36%, right? Over a third. And that's not counting non-patented inventions like or innovations like, the new foods immigrants bring or new sports, new forms of entertainment. In terms of talent, immigrants are 18% of the labor force in the United States, but they do well more than 18% of jobs in key sectors, like in construction and farming, it's over a third. In STEM, AI, biotech, really high-end stuff, they're nearly half of workers and over half of those with graduate degrees. When it comes to consumption, right, another thing, if you have a business, you need consumers. Immigrants have over $1.3 trillion of spending power in America. And then when it comes to taxes, the average immigrant pays over $250,000 in taxes in net present value terms. Anyway, that's a whirlwind of statistics, and I'm sorry that it's so overwhelming. But like, I'm just scratching the surface here, but you can see these are like pretty solid numbers. You tell me of anyone, any mayor, governor, president, or average citizen who says they don't want those 5 things in their community. I don't know anyone who tells me they don't want those 5 things.
I want to go back to the Pollo Campero one because it's really interesting. There's actually one not far from where I live here in Washington, D.C. Actually, there's several in the area, as a matter of fact. You describe a process in the book, and I believe the name to it was, I think, like something like Perez Smith, where it goes from the original immigrant to basically second generation or like a part of that extended network, and then eventually it gets into the local community. Is that chain of custody similar to how all forms of immigration, either investment or, I don't know, assimilation occurs? Is that a common process?
Yeah. So what you're referring to, it's actually Sanchez to Smith, but
There it is.
the concept is the same, right? The idea is that the managers of Pollo Campero are thinking, how do we, because the goal for them is not just to sell chicken to Guatemalans, right? They want to enter they want to succeed in the entire U.S. market. So their strategy was first to target sort of Central Americans who are familiar with Pollo Campero, right? It's the most famous fast food chain in Central America. Then the second Sanchez would be like other Latinos who maybe don't come from Central American countries. And then the Smiths would be the local US, consumers who are not Latino in any way. I think a lot of foreign businesses that follow this kind of immigrant-led investment path often do use the immigrant community as a gateway into the broader American market. But that's true for goods or products that are kind of closely attached to an immigrant community. Food is, of course, a very good example. But in other cases, what immigrants do is they are magnets of investment from a company that really has very little to do with ethnic consumption. An example that I often go to is from my home state of Pennsylvania. I was reading the news a couple years ago, and this company called EMD Electronics announced a $300 million investment in this tiny little town, population like 3,500 in this middle of Pennsylvania. And this company makes like really high end stuff. They make like components for computer chips that like they sell to NVIDIA and Intel. So my point is, this is high end stuff, right? $300 million investment creates 200 skilled manufacturing jobs, right? Again, this is a kind of thing that like a mayor drools about, right? When you dig into like, why would this investment happen in such an unusual place in Pennsylvania? Well, it turns out EMD Electronics is the subsidiary of a German corporation, Merck KGaA. It turns out that this part of Pennsylvania was settled by German immigrants a few centuries ago and still has a strong German heritage. And it's no coincidence that German investment has followed the migration of Germans in the same way that Guatemalan investment has followed the migration of Guatemalans. And there, it's not about targeting a German consumer, right? It's just that immigrants create these networks across countries of information and trust that grease the wheels of investment, right? And so your community gets more investment from a certain place just because people in that place have a connection to the origin of the capital. And so the phrase that I often like to use is that immigration at the end of the day is a human activity, right? It flows through networks of relationships. And so if immigrants create those networks of relationships to different parts of the world, investment from those parts of the world is going to flow through those networks.
One aspect of this that I'm really quite curious about is this idea that, and the data again is quite clear, and I did not know, for example, until I read the book about CAPTCHA, right? The thing that sort of determines whether or not you're a bot or not. This was developed by an immigrant who had come here. I mean, the stories are endless, really, for success in that regard. But I guess the thing I'm trying to get at it here is, in thinking about the economic contribution, what is it about the intrepid or otherwise immigrating spirit that leads them to be so successful on their own when they come here, as well as collaborators for natives, right? I mean, there's this sort of presumption. It's like, well, if there's just a flow of people, why would it be all that different? But yet there clearly is an energizing force. What does the data tell you about why they are able to leverage success so nimbly, both at the high skill and low skill level here?
Yeah, in some ways, that's one of those things where we're still trying to understand all the reasons why. I mean, we do have, like, in terms of the outcome, we have pretty good evidence, right? Like I said, immigrants responsible for 36% of all patents. And what I didn't mention is that they're only about 14, only about 16% of inventors in the US. So they're kind of punching way above their weight, right, when it comes to producing innovation. We know some things. One of the things we know is, again, just like investment is a human activity, so is innovation, right? What is innovation? Innovation is a recombination of ideas put to a novel use, right? And so if you think about the essence of the process of migrating, it is fundamentally a recombinant process, right? Because I used to live in place A. I was deeply embedded there. Maybe I got my education. Maybe I worked there a few years. I saw problems, solutions, technologies, ideas there. And now I moved to place B. And again, I become now embedded there, right? I have new coworkers. I see new issues. I see new needs, new problems. And in that process of saying, wait, I saw this thing in place A that can solve a problem in place B, and eureka, right? You have this recombination moment. And so a lot of the reasons that immigrants introduce a lot of novel things, whether it's technologies or other things, the evidence suggests that it has to do with those connections that they make across place A and place B. And the good news is that it's not just the immigrants that benefit from those connections, is their non-immigrant colleagues and neighbors, right? So that 36% number I gave you can be broken down into two quantities. In about 23% of all cases, immigrants are the direct inventors of a patent in the US. But the other 13%, right, the difference between 36 and 23%, are patents that US-based, US-born inventors, sorry, I don't know why I'm pointing to myself because I'm actually not born in the US, but inventors born in the US, 13% of patents are explained by the fact of US-born inventors collaborating or being around immigrant colleagues, because they themselves are exposed to the new scientific networks, the new ideas, the new ways of thinking that their foreign-born colleagues bring. And so the good news is that it's kind of win-win, right? It's not just the immigrants that are getting the wins, it's the non-immigrants as well. And I want to emphasize that it's not just highbrow stuff like patents, right? Like patents that result in like CAPTCHA or Zoom or Google, but also think of all the non-patented innovations like the new type of food that you love to eat, right? Sushi, naan, or new kinds of music like salsa, or sports like basketball and soccer that you love, that you spend your time on, right? Those are innovations just as much as a patented thing. And anyway, I've been a little long-winded in my answer, but
it will surprise you to learn that my wife, who's from South America, thought that salsa was from South America. After reading your book, I told her, no, it actually is from New York City. She did not realize that part of that remix culture that you had described there. Also, you may not know this as well. I had to look this up because I was like, where's it from? Reggaeton is apparently also a New York City invention, despite all the different sort of hybrid ways and populations crossing over there. If I may, getting back to the tax conversation, there is an enormous amount of consternation around tax about to what extent immigrants are receiving tax benefits and to what extent they're paying in. Yeah. I'm wondering if you could help untangle this for us and help us understand the broader picture of what necessarily they're contributing, what they're getting back, and how that nets out.
Yeah, so that's such a controversial one, right? Are immigrants kind of a drain on our public coffers or not? So I think we have to break this into short and long run and local versus federal in the United States. So let's start with short and long run. In the short run, immigrants can cause fiscal expenses, right? They arrive somewhere. The kids go to school. Maybe that you have to expend a little money on healthcare, maybe a little bit on housing or something like that. So in the short run, it could be that the place that receives the immigrants has to spend more than it receives from that immigrant. By short run, I mean the first months to first several years, maybe up to the first decade that an immigrant or their family is here. In the long run, however, very, very clearly, immigrants more than pay their share and pay back way more than whatever was spent on them. So, for example, one estimate from a sort of pretty famous study done by the National Academies of Science a few years ago shows that in the long run, immigrants contribute on average about $260,000 in taxes, and that's in net present value terms, meaning assuming the U.S. gets the money right now, as opposed to spread over many years, that number is higher. And the children of immigrants actually out-earn the children of natives, which means that they're paying even more taxes than the children of natives. And so when you look at, long run, the life of the immigrant and then the life of the child, there is absolutely no doubt that from a fiscal standpoint, immigrants are a great investment, right? Our public coffers would be much lower without them. So that's the short versus long run. Then there is also the local versus federal. At the federal level, the U.S. by far gets, those net benefits in terms of more taxes paid than services provided to immigrants. The problem is that the local jurisdiction, think of the local city or state that receives the immigrant, sometimes does end up, for the first generation immigrant, paying a little bit more than what it gets back in taxes from that immigrant, primarily because immigrants have more children and it costs a bit more to educate those children. But again, when you look at the taxes that the children and grandchildren of the immigrant pay, it's more than double whatever that jurisdiction spent on educating the children of those first generation immigrants. So again, it's at the local level. In the short run, you can get some costs, but both at the local and federal level, in the long run, you get very clear returns. The one thing I don't mention in the book that I wish I had known this when I wrote that chapter, but this is research that has come out since then, is that that's only focusing on income taxes, right? The income taxes paid by the immigrant. If you factor in corporate taxes, right? Because corporations hire workers, including immigrant workers, and they pay taxes on the profit those workers help contribute. When you factor in corporate taxes, then every single immigrant very quickly has a positive net fiscal benefit, right? And so actually, if you add up income and corporate taxes, the news is like really, really good kind of across the board, right? And that's true even for the lowest skilled immigrant, because the company that hires that low skill immigrant is still paying taxes on the profits they make.
Yeah, I was going to say, one of the things that is part of the story that you tell in the book more broadly is, of course, there are there are contributions for the first wave of immigrants, no doubt about it, but there can be a little bit more friction as a consequence. But taking a broader picture, and then when you begin to evaluate second and third generations, as you indicate, the investment really begins to pay off downstream from there, right? That's a fair way to characterize it.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think you can see people as a cost, or you can see people as an investment. The reality is that new people always cost a little bit, right? I mean, I have several children, right? Of course my kids are a cost, right? I mean, obviously they cost me a lot, but they're costing my community something in providing their service. But it would be the dumbest conclusion in the world would be to say, therefore, let's not have any new people. Right? That's like saying, yeah, sure, I can save money, in the short run by not making any investments, but then that will catch up with me very quickly. And so yes, new people, just like babies, they are a short run cost, but in the long run, especially when you look over generations, there's a return on investment. And so I think there is a fair conversation here, Luke, that we should be having about taxes and fiscal issues when it comes to immigrants, is that the U.S. is not, the arrival points of immigrants are not equally distributed across the U.S., right? And so border states, for example, do pay a disproportionate share of the fiscal burden for welcoming the first generation. And then, if those immigrants move to the interior, those interior states get benefits without bearing the initial cost. So I think there's a very fair conversation to be had of how do we distribute those initial costs more evenly, right? And I think the federal government could have some kind of redistributive scheme. But that would be a smart policy conversation. So many of the other conversations we're having are just dumb, right? Because they're based on problems that don't exist. But I think it's a fair one to have, right? And I think there's probably a lot of good solutions to that we just don't take the time to think through.
One of the ways, in terms of this investment conversation, that I had my eyes opened was the ways in which the book continually goes back to the National Origins Act of 1924. And this was something I only knew as a historical footnote. I did not really know much about it beyond what I learned in U.S. history in high school. If you could explain to the audience what this act was. And the reason why I ask it in the context of this investment conversation is almost that what you lay out as the opportunity cost that we suffered by engaging in it, only to get eventually immigration reform many, many decades later. But can you speak to the act and then that opportunity cost that was associated with it for its draconian policy?
Yeah, this is really important, I think, for us to know in this moment because we're in, I think it's fair to say that the Trump administration is restrictive on immigration and wishes for a lot less of it. And there's been a lot of questions as well, what would be the consequences of mass restrictions and mass expulsions? Well, we don't actually need to speculate because we did this before with the 1924 National Origins Act. To explain the act, I have to go a few decades earlier in history. So if we do a very quick, very quick overview of U.S. immigration history, we essentially had what you would call open borders, no restrictions for the first, many decades of our history. And, then in the 1880s, we kind of limited the entry of Chinese immigrants, but pretty much didn't really have any barriers. What changed was that up until about 1885, 1890, most of the immigrants were arriving from Northern and Western Europe, England, Germany, Scandinavia. And then in 1890, there was a big shift where most immigrants started arriving from Southern and Eastern Europe. So now we're talking Italy, Russia, Ukraine, Greece. And so instead of having sort of what was then considered white Protestant immigrants primarily, with the exception of the Irish who were Catholic, we started having a lot of immigrants that were kind of Catholic and Jewish, that were considered non-white actually at the time. And so by 1910 or so, most immigrants, and there were millions and millions of immigrants coming from those countries. And political elites and others started becoming really worried that these immigrants were inferior. You have to remember, this is also the time of the rise of eugenics. So the idea that there were certain races, this is the term we used at the time, races, that were superior to others, right? And so the thought was that Southern and Eastern Europeans were sort of mentally inferior, morally deficient, economically inferior, that their religion would sort of threaten the foundations of the American Constitution and the American culture, right? If any of this sounds familiar, it's because the arguments then were very similar to what we're saying today about Asians and Latin Americans. Anyway, all of that led to a movement that started working very earnestly to restrict immigration, to especially to block immigrants from these undesirable countries. And so in 1924, a little bit kind of supercharged by the national security concerns that came out of World War I, a group of politicians led by the likes of like Henry Cabot Lodge and Johnson and others, they set for the first time in the history of the U.S. a quota system. But these were openly racist quotas that said, okay, we're going to take the fraction of immigrants from every country that were in the U.S. as of 1890, right? And then we'll only allow 2 to 3% of that number, of the number of immigrants from those countries that were in the U.S. as of 1890 to enter any given year. Why dial the clock back to 1890? Because by then, very few Southern and Eastern Europeans had arrived. So the effect was, essentially, you killed all immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe. The quota for Asia was set to 0, and you essentially only allowed immigrants from England and Northern and other Western European countries. And that decimated immigration. So immigration went from 15% of the US population to less than 5% over the next 40 years, which was the lowest point ever. And the consequences of that were not good, right? They were bad for the country. They led to less investment. For example, places, even to this day, places most affected by those restrictions get less foreign investment. It led to a decline. So inventors who were most exposed to the loss of immigrant colleagues because of those laws suffered a 70% permanent decline in patent productivity. US workers lost jobs and their wages declined. Anyway, I could keep going. But we live in a moment that is very, very similar to the lead up to that law.
What are the through lines in terms of the political conditions that exist between then and now? Are there any? Are there meaningful similarities politically?
I think there are some, yes. I think there are some, and some of the parallels are uncanny. For example, World War I was a very traumatic moment for America, right? To be dragged into a European war. And I think, 9/11, plus some of the other wars and terrorism issues that followed, and the US kind of being dragged into an interminable war, kind of led to this real shift, right? In the feeling that outsiders could be threatening. For example, putting immigration under the Department of Homeland Security was a response to 9/11, right? It was a reorganization of immigration and the creation of the Department of Homeland Security. The other is that immigration was increasing. From 1890 to 1920s, immigration went from about 10 to 15% of the population, is a very large increase in just a few decades. And now we've reached a point where from 1965 to now, immigration increased from about 5 to 15% of the population. So there seems to be something about immigrants reaching about 15% of the population, where people start to worry that the country is somehow, changing too much. And also a change in origins, right? And so if back then the new origin was Southern and Eastern Europe, today it's Asia and Latin America. And there's this argument that these immigrants are different, they're not quite the same, maybe they won't assimilate successfully. Those are some interesting parallels, right? And then the rise of Trumpism is kind of similar to the rise of presidents like Calvin Coolidge. Calvin Coolidge is the hero of Stephen Miller, right? Stephen Miller is Trump's immigration architect. And so there are some pretty uncanny parallels, yes.
Unfortunate to say the least. All right. In terms of some of the questions I had about the literature, or to what extent is there anything academically that you could point to as robust data that does show some of the friction that comes with the immigrant experience? And I don't have a lot necessarily that I thought was worth asking you, but I had a couple of things, if I may.
Yeah.
One, Senator Bernie Sanders, who I would not widely describe as anti-immigrant, nevertheless does hold what I would consider to be some anti-immigrant views, or at bare minimum, something of a skepticism, particularly around what happens to natives' wages when we allow for worker guest programs. Is there anything to that worldview?
On the economic side, if there were one myth that I could debunk, that would be the one. In the 90s and early 2000s, there were some research studies conducted by a pretty prominent economist named George Borjas, who is still at Harvard, that claimed to show that the arrival of low-skilled immigrants lowered the wages of low-skilled natives, particularly high school dropouts. Those studies were published in reputable journals, and they sort of were pretty widely accepted. But like I said at the very beginning, in the last 20 to 25 years, we've had just much better data, and those studies have been debunked. And in fact, what we now believe based on the evidence is exactly the opposite, that the arrival of even of unskilled immigrants has either no effect on the wages of natives or a small positive effect. 2 to 3% is the most recent estimate in a study done with data covering the last 25 years in the US. Now that seems counterintuitive, right? Because someone like Bernie Sanders would say, wait, how is that possible, right? There were 100 US workers, you get 100 immigrant workers, you now have 200 people competing for the same jobs. But that is incorrect, or you could even say small-minded, because the strong assumption there is that the economic pie stays exactly the same, right? That there are still only 100 jobs as there were before. But the arrival of 100 new immigrants means also that you have 100 new consumers, investors, taxpayers, et cetera, right? Those 5 things I mentioned. So the economic pie grows. When you have a bigger economy, you just need more workers. So the arrival of immigrants itself creates economic growth, which itself necessitates more workers. And then the second explanation for why that doesn't happen is that immigrants and non-immigrants, they do different jobs, particularly on the low skill side, right? If you want an everyday example of that, go to your local restaurant and pay attention to who does the dishes versus who cooks versus who serves you, right? Versus who welcomes you, and you just see kind of this division of labor where immigrants do certain jobs, non-immigrants do others that favor their language skills. And so then they're not competing, but they're rather complementing each other and letting a business run or an industry function. So when you understand those two things, you can see why Bernie Sanders, I get it. He's coming from a place where he's worried about the American worker, but he need not be for those two reasons.
There was a German study. I have it up here if I can give the name if need be. It looked from 1984 to 2018, and it found that refugees and economic migrants, which is an important difference, that they have what they call occupational downgrading, which is working below their qualifications.
Yeah.
And it persisted a long time for wage and employment returns, and that refugees downgrade more than economic migrants. But language acquisition is critical in improving both outcomes. I wonder to what extent, I grant that this is a fairly narrow subset of what we consider immigrants, but the refugee side, are there more points of friction on the refugee side as it relates to their participation in the economy and or societal integration?
So I think in general, let me first start really general. I think generally a pattern that is true is that the many immigrants, especially those who don't have high levels of skill, have a hard time entering the labor force, and their wages never quite catch up to the wages of a comparable non-immigrant, right? On the first generation, their kids do very well, but so the fact that many immigrants suffer a wage disadvantage is true. Refugees often, because of their force, right? They weren't planning to migrate, often do have to suffer occupational downgrading. But that's not saying that hurts a non-immigrant, right? That's just saying that they are not able to use all of the same skills that they did in their home country. Those are two different statements. What's interesting, though, is that actually, on average, refugees do quite well, in part because if they're official legal refugees, they have a lot of help when they come in, right? They get food assistance, they get housing assistance, they get work permits right away. And so refugees actually do very well. Leah Bustan and Rana have some pretty good evidence on this, that refugees actually kind of out-assimilate non-refugees because of the help they get. The ones who are going to struggle the most would be undocumented or illegal immigrants, right? Because they are not here through regular channels. They don't have work permits. It's very hard for them to prove their credentials. And so they will often struggle, but that struggle relative to other immigrants and relative to natives, they're still doing better on average than they did in their home countries, right? And they're not taking away jobs from non-immigrants. And so, obviously we would want them to assimilate faster, and we would not want irregular immigration. But if the concern is that natives will be hurt, I think you can put that one to bed. If the concern is that we would want immigrants or refugees or undocumented immigrants to kind of rise faster, I think that's a valid concern. We would want that. Yeah.
What do most people not understand about illegal immigration that they need to? How should people understand what illegal immigration is, what contributes to it, and what happens once they get here? Another large question, but a good place to start, I think.
Yeah, it's a great question. Please stop me if I just get too long-winded on this one, because there's just so much to it. The U.S. has a very large illegal, undocumented, irregular population, whatever term you prefer to use, right? About a quarter of all immigrants are undocumented in this country. That's about 14 million individuals. That's a lot of people. So the fact that that's a big issue is not under dispute. It's not as big as, Trump says it's like over 20 million. It's not that big. It's about 14 million. But it's still big, right? I mean, 14 million is still a lot, right? And we would want it to be zero. When you have that much, right, not just that much in numbers, but that much as a share, the question is, what's the problem, right? And you can't say when a quarter of all you can't say it's a bunch of bad apples when a quarter of your apples are bad, so to speak, right? That's a problem with the system. And so I think the first thing I would want people to understand is that the main cause of undocumented immigration in this country is that our system not only encourages it, but strongly incentivizes it. That is, it's a problem of our own creation, right? And that might seem like, wait, why? How did we create that problem? Well, it's because our system, let me use economics terms, the legal supply of immigrants we allow is much lower than the demand for people we have, both economically and for family reunification and other reasons. Our system, our immigration system in the US right now dates to 1990. What I always like to tell my students is that our immigration system is older than the internet, right? And so they gasp and they're like, what could possibly be older than the internet? So if you think about 1990, right? It's a totally different world situation, totally different economy. Totally different needs, totally different demographic profile in the US. So in 1990 was the last time we set quotas for the number and types of and types of visas we would allow. And so we only give about 1 million green cards per year. Of that million, about two-thirds goes for immigrants that are reuniting with their families, and only 140,000 are green cards that are employer sponsored. That is, economically motivated migrants who are sponsored by an employer. Just think of that number for a second, Luke. 140,000 per year for a whole country, right? As big as the US. I mean, your state, I don't know where you live, but I'm sure your state could use 140,000 of them every year. Here's another, fun fact about our system. If you're a farmer in the middle of Iowa and you need year-round workers, okay, and you can't find them among the U.S. born because they don't do farm work, guess how many visas there are for permanent farm workers? The answer is 0. We do not have permanent visas for farm workers. We don't have visas for carpenters. We don't have visas for a lot of categories of skill that our country desperately needs. Why? Because we just haven't updated our system since 1990. And it's not just low skill stuff. If you're an Indian with a master's degree trying to get a green card through an EB2 category, you have to wait in line over, nearly 200 years at the moment. Nearly 200 years, right? Because there's so few visas for Indians in that category. And so when our system is just so decrepit, so divorced from reality, what you get is you have legal supply is this low, the real demand is this high. How do we fill the gap? We do it through our illegal or irregular immigration system, right? Is that the right way to do it? Well, no, of course not, right? I'll be the first one to say, but we do need those people, right? We need them to work the farms. We need them to work the factories. We need them to build our houses. But we just don't have a way to give them a legal pathway simply because our system doesn't allow it. And so we're just kind of hypocritically allowing them to come in, letting them work, letting them pay taxes, but not giving them a legal pathway. And so anyway, I'll stop there. But that's the biggest thing. Understand the discrepancy between what we allow and what we need.
Again, playing devil's advocate here. Yeah, sure. Folks might say, well, okay, yes, they're coming to do jobs, but what's really happening is they're just pouring over a border, right? Because they're leaving, for example, there might be, national or economic unrest in Venezuela or parts of Central America. They're fleeing that cheap available jobs up north. There's no real security. That's why they're in. In fact, if you tighten security at the border, we can solve this problem. To that, you would say?
To that, I would say, that's what we've been trying since 1965, right? And look where we are. Now, it's true, for example, the Trump administration in the last 6 months, they have succeeded in the narrow goal of having illegal or irregular border crossings essentially at 0, right? If you are draconian enough, you can do that. The question is that the goal by itself, right? Because, for example, in the latest jobs report that President Trump railed against so much that he fired the person who produced the report, right? One of the reasons that we have so few jobs in such an increasingly sputtering economy is that since Trump took office, we're over 1 million foreign-born workers short. Over 1 million foreign-born workers short. That means employers that cannot hire these people, right? That means 1 million fewer consumers, 1 million fewer people paying taxes. And so you either choke the economy or as we've done for decades, we sort of hypocritically kind of let them through and benefit from what they produce, but we don't give them a way to regularize. And by the way, we have evidence that shows that legal pathways are perfect substitutes for illegal pathways. That is, if you make a legal pathway available, people won't follow illegal pathways, right? So it's not like if you make more legal pathways available, you create even a bigger incentive for more illegality. It's just that we don't allow enough legal pathways. So again, what do we need to do? Well, look, it's not 1990 anymore, right? Don't forget also that it's basic math. Our birth rates are at 1.6, so we're not producing new workers and new people. So where are we going to get them, right? We either automate everything, which Japan has been trying to do for decades and it hasn't worked, or we face reality and increase the legal pathways. It's just math, right? I'm not even making a compassionate argument here. I could, but I'm not even making a compassionate. I'm just saying that it's in our self-interest to give legal pathways. Otherwise, the U.S. economy is going to suffer.
There's no question there's a reliance on illegal immigration and the labor that it provides. Yeah. So I want to be clear. In all the data you have already spoken about in terms of just on the tax side, they're big contributors. But I'm wondering if you could speak more to like what we know about the economic performance of illegal immigrants. I'm going to guess that talking about the wage downscaling, because they can't rely on the same system of credentials or the other things to validate their identity to enable them to participate in the economy, they're going to be somewhat limited in what they can do. No?
Yeah, they are limited. But the tragedy, I know this is going to sound controversial, right? But this is consistent with the data. Again, and I'm speaking economically, right? To be clear, to be on the record, I think we should have more regular legal pathways, right? I'm not saying I want more irregular immigration, but from a hard-nosed, blind, sort of dispassionate economic standpoint, the economy doesn't care what your papers say, right? Right. So whether you're here legally or not, you are bringing those 5 things I mentioned earlier. The economic tragedy of illegal immigration is that it limits the quantity or the level of those 5 things an immigrant can bring. I'll give you a story that I mentioned in the book. My barber is an undocumented immigrant from Latin America. He's you wouldn't know it from looking at me, but he's actually very good and very popular. Meaning, there's always a line out the door to have him cut your hair, right? And we've become pretty good friends, and so I've learned a lot over the years about like kind of what it means to live undocumented for him. And again, I mentioned that he's very popular for this reason. He has for years wanted to open his own barber shop and start his own business, and he would have the clientele. He once told me he had over $200,000 in cash ready to invest, right, in a new business. I just about fell off my chair, and I was like, "You have what? How much money in cash?" And I'm like, "Well, why don't you do it?" And he's like, "I can't, right? Because of my legal status, it's just too risky, to lease a commercial space and to buy a business." And so, what the point is this: his lack of legal status is preventing him from making a big investment that would create jobs, that would pay taxes, that would provide a valuable service, et cetera, right? Now, he's still adding value as working for someone else. He's still providing a lot of those 5 things, but just think of how much more he could be if he weren't limited. And so when you have 14 million people that have that ceiling on what they can contribute, that's another another dispassionate economic reason to find a way to legalize them, is because you would unleash a lot more economic potential than what you're allowing right now.
I have 2 more lines of inquiry. One, if I can, in terms of either legal or illegal immigration, I'm not sure to what extent there's a difference you could tease out, but either way, what do we know about the crime statistics as it relates to immigrants? And that is true both for the ones that come, second generation, legal, illegal, however it can be meaningfully evaluated.
Yeah. So again, this is, I would say, sort of after the idea that immigrants take jobs, the most harped on word about immigrants in our administration is criminals, these criminal aliens, criminal foreigners. This is one where the data is the most unambiguous. So you asked me at the beginning, how confident can we be in the data? This is the one where we are the most confident, right? That is, it's scientifically dishonest to say anything other than immigrants have the lowest crime rate in this country. and undocumented immigrants have the lowest among all immigrants, right? And so it's exactly the opposite of what people think. And there's many ways to look at that. One is you can look at the rate of crime for certain categories. So whether it's violent crime, property crime, drug crime, right? And however you slice the data, whether it's nationally, state by state, what you see is undocumented immigrants have the lowest rate, documented immigrants have the second lowest, and non-immigrants have the highest rate, right? On whatever category of crime you look at. You can also look at what happens to crime in communities when immigrants arrive. Does it go up or down? Overwhelmingly, it just doesn't change, right? Because immigrants are not bringing crime. You could look at incarceration rates. And on this, we have very old data all the way back to the 1800s. And if you look historically, immigrants have always had a lower incarceration rate than non-immigrants, right? And that's even if you break it down by race. And actually, that gap has been widening over time. So since 1960, immigrants have an even lower incarceration rate than non-immigrants. So look, I can slice the data however you want. The conclusion is you are actually safer with immigrants than not, right? Like, if you want to reduce aggregate crime statistics, invite immigrants in rather than the opposite. And someone might be saying, well, why undocumented immigrants? Well, the answer is pretty simple, right? What's the quickest way to get deported is be caught for a crime. So you have a very strong deterrent. I'm not saying that's a reason to keep people undocumented for the other reasons we mentioned earlier, but that's just a lie. Like, so the way I'd put it is that's just a flat out lie, right? And the fact that it's been so effective is beyond me, right? I get it, right? That political ad with the grainy imagery of the undocumented immigrant who murdered someone. I mean, that's powerful, right? That's moving. And that particular story is true, but statistically, it's not true. In fact, it's quite the opposite, right? We should be showing grainy pictures of non-immigrants committing crimes if we want it to be statistically accurate.
Which leads me to the second part of my line of inquiry that I mentioned, which is higher education. And I have a question on sort of two levels. One, you mentioned like when 100 immigrants come to a community, that's a lot to absorb, but of course they're now expanding the pie. It's not just the supply side, the demand side changes. But when you're dealing with college, there is a finite amount of people that Harvard or UVA or Wharton, where you go, will admit. It's a little bit more fixed. So I wonder what you think the appropriate role of immigrants or foreign students who come here, which often there is a direct relationship to them staying. And then, I think your story is exactly that, if I'm not mistaken, right? From higher education, then sort of establishing a life here. And then secondly, as it relates to, it's somewhat separate from H-1B or from higher education, but the H-1B visa issue, and in terms of how you believe we don't have enough of them, but there is a debate, certainly on the West Coast and in tech, about where we're just getting them, we're bringing in H-1B visa holders. We were able to keep wages low, and then Elon Musk can fire half of Twitter and then keep these guys there, because if they say no, they have to leave. And so it's a sort of way to police labor. It's a bigger question, but let's start on what the role should be for immigrants inside higher education.
Yeah. So, that's a good question. So the U.S. has educated so many international students, right? I think I don't quote me on the exact numbers, but something like 1 million per year arrive or something. So at any given point in time, we have about 4 million international students. That, maybe that's a little too high, but anyway, the numbers are pretty large. So yeah, the question I think you could ask, well, are those immigrants sort of taking the seats of non-immigrants? I don't know that we have really good data on that. I think it's a fair question, because unlike, say, the rest of the economy, where those 100 immigrants arrive and the economic pie can grow, if Penn or Harvard or University of Pennsylvania or Iowa State doesn't increase enrollment, but it is bringing, say, more international students, something's got to give, right? Somebody's not getting in. And so, anything with finite admissions it is more likely to have zero sum. I don't have good numbers on that. The other thing we do know that I can say is that immigrants and non-immigrants kind of sort into different majors. So for example, immigrants disproportionately go into STEM majors. a lot of non-immigrants, a lot of natives simply are not majoring in engineering, math, science, microbiology. And so in as much as there's just different preferences for majors, you're going to have less competition. And we are seeing that then on the labor market side, immigrants play a disproportionate role there, and firms are not finding enough non-immigrant workers with those skills. So I don't know if the college enrollment thing is representing the pull of the labor market or something else. So I'm going to refrain from saying too much about that, but I'll concede that at least in theory, it's possible that if the amount of seats is finite, you could be getting some competition. At the same time, you have to think of the net effect of what welcoming those immigrants are, right? Because if they're disproportionately starting businesses and investing in all that upon graduation, then on average we could still be better off. But again, I don't want to just speculate about that. H-1Bs, okay. So I think let's separate our need for skilled workers like the ones that are recruited through the H-1B program and the H-1B program itself. There is no doubt that we desperately have a shortage of people with the kinds of skills that we recruit through the H-1B, right? College educated, particularly with STEM skills, right? In many industries, I'll give you AI as an example, right? So in the field of AI in the US, 53% of PhDs in AI are foreign born, right? Without immigrants, we don't have ChatGPT, we don't have Gemini, we don't our AI industry doesn't exist without immigrants. I mean, just look at the founders and top managers of OpenAI and all the satellite companies that have spun out from there. It's kind of a who's who of what country did they come from? And again, these are net job creators, and so the fact that we need these workers is I think that's pretty undeniable. The H-1B program is kind of, as far as temporary paths, temporary workers with those skills, it's the only thing we have. So if the choice is between scrapping the H-1B program and keeping it, we have to keep it. Now, are there ways that we can improve the design of the program? For sure, right? One of the weaknesses of the program is that the employer completely controls the visa of that worker, right? And so H-1B workers, I mean, in principle, they can move jobs, but it's very complicated. So often they're kind of stuck with that employer, especially if that employer sponsors them for a green card. Then they can stay on the H-1B until they get the green card, but that might be a decade in which they're kind of stuck with that employer. So I would love for more flexibility that allows for the workers to move. Now, the one thing that the evidence debunks is the companies use the H-1B visa to lowball on wages, right? There's been studies done on this. One of them that's very good shows that, that firms don't recruit H-1B workers until they have exhausted the possibility of hiring someone in the native labor market. They're not required to do so, but so basically the likelihood of filling a position with an H-1B worker is higher the longer the job has been posted but not filled. And also, actually, it's higher as the wage increases, right? So firms are required to pay sort of a minimum, but the firms that get more H-1B workers actually pay way above that. So that kind of debunks the idea that this is just like shortchanging sort of native tech workers. Again, there could be evidence that comes out to contradict that, but so far the evidence we have doesn't show that.
With that, you've been very generous with your time. So with that in mind, let me just ask this. You've kind of pieced, you've alluded to different pieces of it, I should say, through the course of this conversation. But if I made you immigration czar, if I had the power to do such a thing, and I made you immigration czar, walk me through what in 2025, heading into 2026, what does a complete, comprehensive, sensible immigration reform in the United States look like?
So first, we have to start with the framing, right? I mean, think about this for a second. What does it tell you that we have put the Department of Homeland Security as the agency in charge of our immigration apparatus, right? I mean, that's a very interesting framing, right? Immigration is a security issue, something we have to protect you from. And the premise of that is again that immigrants are villains. Immigrants are here to take things away from you. Instead, imagine if we put, say, Department of Commerce, or we created kind of a separate Department of Immigration or Department of Global Talent, call it what you will. Framing is totally different, because now what you have is bureaucrats who, instead of thinking every day as how do we keep people out, they're thinking of how do we harness the economic and other benefits that immigrants bring. So that's not just symbolic, that is very practical, is which agency is in charge. And it cannot be DHS. Now, of course, DHS may be secondary responsibility to ensure we don't have security issues, but they shouldn't be primarily in charge. The second thing we have to do is we have to increase the number of visas we allow. It's not 1990 anymore, right? We have to double or triple the number of immigrants we allow. Why? Because we're in a demographic cliff. Our birth rates are so low that there's no other way to get new people into this country. The other is that we need to diversify the types of visas we allow, right? Again, it's not 1990 anymore, right? 0 visas for farmers, carpenters, and drywall installers makes no sense, right? And also, we're in a world of AI and very different skills, and so we need visas that reflect the economic reality. Of course, we need to preserve the family reunification visas, but we already have a good number of those. And then the third thing is we need the system to be updated more frequently and more flexibly. If you think about it, we've only changed the number and types of visas we allow in this country 3 times, right? 1924, 1965, and 1990. That's crazy, right? I mean, setting quotas for the next 40 years. I mean, I don't even know what's going to happen 5 years from now, let alone 40. And so instead, we should be having a framework that we can update, at least in terms of the number of visas, very frequently, annually, or at most every 3 years. Right? Remove Congress from setting quotas, right? Congress doesn't need to do that. Congress can set the framework, but then let the data drive the quotas. I think if we do those 4 things, we'll at least have the skeleton of a system that's more functional, and then we'll reduce a lot of the political infighting because the system starts matching reality more frequently, and then there's less openings for politicians to use it as an issue that really has nothing to do with immigration.
The last thing I would say on this, I don't know if I even have a question, but it's just something I felt like articulating, which is in reading this book and in having this conversation and thinking about my own experiences, there is this sort of sentiment in America that we can do damage to immigrants. We can deport them. We can tax them. We can limit their freedom of anything, really, movement, articulation of ideas, and that it doesn't harm us.
Yeah.
But it is us. Like there is, the two are inextricably linked. You cannot localize the pain that we inflict upon them. There is no way but for it to come back on us. And I hope that, I'm sure you probably agree with that, but that's one of the sort of prevailing things that I take with me in thinking about all of this.
Very well said. And if we understood that, everything would change, right? Because it's not about them, it's about us. Yeah.
Well, we've gone from, you're the antidote to they're eating the dogs, they're eating the cats. No, here's actually all the evidence for these kinds of claims and considerations about.
But I'm not winning, right? I mean,
that's why we're talking. That's why we're talking, because you deserve to be winning. This is what should be winning, and I realize this is a small contribution towards it, but it's your voice is extremely important, I think, in this moment, and I really appreciate the conversation. Of course, the book, you can see it over his shoulder there, "The Truth About Immigration," Professor Zeke Hernandez. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Luke. Such a pleasure and great questions. Thank you.